Welcome everyone to the May 15th Eugene City Council work session. The topic today is the Eugene Water and Electric Board Riverfront Master Plan, something that we've not been permitted to think about for a very long time. But here we are. So, okay, ready, set, go. All right.
Thanks, Mayor. And you're right, it has been out in the community for quite a while, and it's nice to bring this to all of you for what is the first of several work sessions, public hearings, a variety of meetings to where we hope is an eventual adoption of not really the master plan, but and Gabe will talk about the specifics of that. But it's nice that we're able to do this. Really, today is starting off as an information session, which we can ask questions, provide some feedback, and all of those kinds of things. Just as a reminder, this is a quasi-judicial process. Requires that the initial work session be limited to factual information and questions, and there'll be other times to express opinions on those. And if there's some questions, Glenn, of course, is here and can respond to any of those kinds of things. Gabe and Nan will be starting off as a presentation. Randy Leddick from the Planning Commission will then provide some insight from the Planning Commission on their deliberations. You'll have the benefit of that information as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gabe and Nan.
Thanks, John. So today we have some slides to help walk us through the master planning process, and we'll talk a little bit about the history and all of the implementing tools in the adoption package. The hope today is to help build Council's understanding of the project overall before we move into the public hearing and deliberations. But before we dive in, I wanted to mention all the hard work on the part of eWeb's staff, their consultant team, all the community advisory team members, and the public that committed their time and effort to the project to date and getting to this point. I'd also like to thank the Planning Commission for their thorough review and input, which led to a unanimous recommendation for approval back in March. So today we're going to cover a little bit about the history of the master plan process. We'll talk about the key master plan components. We'll give you a summary of the various land use applications involved, and these are really the regulatory actions that are needed to implement the concept and the vision in the master plan. We'll talk about the key form-based code elements. We'll also talk about the proposal for a riverfront park, and then we'll touch on next steps. After I run through the presentation, we'll also hear from Randy Leddick to give a little bit of a summary of the Planning Commission's review and recommendations. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nan.
You'll need to get near a mic.
Yes. Thank you. Our community has long desired a connection from downtown to the river. It is a part of who we are. We have 13 miles of riverfront in the city. It's a little bit hard to see the river. Gabe, can you point out the tiny purple dot that represents the eWeb property? Down a little bit? Yeah. The portion closest to downtown is along the eWeb waterfront from 8th to 4th, just about a quarter mile, and that's the area that you can just barely see shown in purple on the map. We've been working with eWeb and the community to move from vision to concept to plan to implementation. The first step in that implementation is to create the regulatory framework, and that's the task we're beginning today. I'm going to give you a little context for today's meeting. The 2004 Downtown Plan recognized the vision for a connection between downtown and the river and gave us direction to incorporate the Willamette River as an integral element, to collaborate with eWeb to encourage relocation of the utility facilities away from the riverfront, to facilitate development between downtown and the river, and to create a master plan to be approved by City Council. The Downtown Plan also spelled out the criteria for the master plan. It was to create a people place with variable setbacks, environmentally respectful, and a Eugene place, a place on the river that helps tell the story of our community. These criteria represent a value-based planning approach and they were included in the downtown plan and later codified into the land use code. The photo on the top right is inside the steam plant. That's one of the buildings on the site that's proposed for preservation and adaptive reuse. After a series of public meetings in 2007, City Council and eWeb entered into a memorandum of understanding to articulate the master planning process. We jointly agreed to the following: to have a community advisory team, a CAT team, with some members selected by eWeb and some by City Council, to have a consultant-led planning process, a robust community engagement process, including at least 4 large community meetings in addition to the CAT meetings and discussion. And the slide there, I know the lighting isn't great here, but it's showing a group of involved citizens playing with different pieces, actually cardboard cutouts, to talk about what should go on the site. As the timeline shows, the memorandum of understanding was approved in 2007. The community advisory team began meeting in 2008 and held about 40 public meetings and 4 large public workshops prior to presenting the master plan to the eWeb Board of Commissioners, who unanimously approved the draft master plan in 2010. The consultant team then spent about a year developing the land use applications to codify and essentially implement the master plan and present it for City of Eugene review last year. The Planning Commission reviewed the master plan, held a public hearing, and forwarded their recommendation to Council, and we're now starting the review process at the Council level. Throughout this process, hundreds of community members attended the public workshops and provided input into the process. Here's what we heard. Here's what eWeb heard and the consultant team heard. Create a place along the river that brings people there, create uses and development that keep people on site, and create a publicly accessible riverfront park. All along, the master plan was shaped by the public input and by technical information and research on the site. The goal was to work collaboratively and deliberately to create a thoughtful public process with the best outcome in mind. The focus has been on the vision for an active, inviting, sustainable downtown riverfront that speaks to who and where we are. The master plan is the result of that work. Gabe will lead you through the details of the master plan. I'll be available for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Nan. So with that context, I think this diagram helps to show some of the fundamental building blocks of the concept. It shows some of the essential features, including the block pattern. You can see the redevelopment parcels in the darker color here, and the park along the river in green. You can also see the connection of 5th and 8th Avenues to the new riverfront street that loops through the site here. So basically, I think this gives you an idea of a starting point for the master plan process, and that builds toward the code provisions we'll get into a little more detail about. So this next illustration is from the master plan, and I think it helps to show what eWeb intends to accomplish with the vision. You can get a sense of the expanded open space along the river. You can see there's a new relocated bike path along the river, as well as you can begin to see the orientation of buildings along the new redevelopment parcels. You can see some of the details, including Restaurant Row here in the middle. And I think it helps to understand what we hope to accomplish in terms of implementing all the regulatory tools.
Point out Restaurant Row to me, please.
3.
3?
So this next illustration, I think, is
Without glasses, I'm not really getting that one.
we'll get there with some more detail.
It's the dark blue deal there on the map.
I'll point it out again here. Sure. So I think this is another good illustration from the master plan that shows the intent. It's the vision of what eWeb hopes to achieve through all the implementing tools, and you can begin to see an expanded open space along the river. You can see the new relocated bike path boardwalk and plaza area. You can see Restaurant Row, and as you move away from the river, you can begin to see the sort of increasing intensity of development on the mixed-use parcels toward the right of that slide there. So, as for the land use applications involved, these really are this is the package of implementing regulations, and it includes a Metro Plan amendment that would essentially change the site from its current industrial designation to mixed use. We also have refinement plan amendments to address some of the older policies in the downtown plan and the riverfront park study. Basically, those would become obsolete with adoption of EWEB's new plan. And so we also have a new special area zone that's proposed for the EWEB property, similar to Walnut Station in that it uses some form-based elements. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the presentation. So we'll be creating a new zone as well as rezoning the property as part of the package. And then lastly, we also have a proposal in the package for a Willamette Greenway permit. And that permit would, at least as it's proposed, would remain in effect so long as the zoning does. And so as a package, these really are the tools that are intended to carry out the vision. So in terms of the special area zoning, I think it's important for council to understand some of the key form-based elements and how those differ somewhat from traditional zoning. And I think at the risk of oversimplifying here, I would say that form-based codes tend to use graphics to make the code more user-friendly, easier to understand. And so in that way, it differs from traditional codes, which always tend to rely on code text. We'll have a combination of both here. And so it's really, I think, we call it a hybrid code in that it blends the old with the new, and this new zoning district needs to be integrated with the rest of our land use code provisions. It also incorporates urban design principles, and we'll talk more about that as well. And just generally, the idea is that it's easier to administer, that it creates certainty for the public, for staff, for developers who are maybe interested in redeveloping the parcels. And so in that sense, the hope is to create a user-friendly code that heightens our level of certainty about what we intend to happen there. And so I'm sure some of you may remember Walnut Station and were involved in the adoption of that. One of the things that this code also does is to rely on a broader set of allowed uses and relies on categories of use rather than attempting to identify and define every single use, the idea being to create more flexibility and to have a more generous mixing of uses. So that's another one of the tools that's embedded within the new code. So some of those features we'll talk about, and I have a slide for each of these, is use controls, urban design standards, adaptive reuse provisions. We'll talk a little bit about development setbacks, park and open space provisions, and then the design review process. So this diagram it actually shows the regulating plan from the proposed code. And in the darker color there, you can see the mixed-use zoned areas, and in the lighter green color, you can see the parks and open space zoning. Those circled areas there represent areas with particular use controls, and so for Restaurant Row, what we have is a limitation in terms of the allowed uses that's specific to entertainment, retail, and really the idea of favoring sort of food service uses and creating an active use there adjacent to the river. And along the far side of the riverfront street there, along that frontage, we have controls that will ensure that office and institutional uses would only be allowed above the first floor. So the idea is to encourage an active street front with retail uses. And we also have along that frontage and at the corner of High Street as well a minimum requirement for at least one story of residential use. So in effect, this acts as a minimum residential density requirement. It also helps to establish the kind of form we expect to see out of the code. And I think, again, as I mentioned previously, the idea with the use list is to try to encourage a mixing of uses, but with some specific limitations in these areas, which were, I think, of particular interest in the master plan. The idea is really trying to form an active streetscape. It's kind of a Main Street feel, and we have some other design standards we'll talk about that help to create that look and feel. So in terms of the urban design standards, I think this slide helps to show, these are examples of the code diagrams that we'll be using. And on the left you can see what represents a maximum building envelope, and it shows some of the other features that we have built into the code. So along some of those key frontages we have what we call a build to line, which requires that the building be brought up to the street. We have maximum height limit, minimum height requirement in certain areas, which is 3 to 4 stories, other than Restaurant Row. We also have a minimum first floor height, which also helps to contribute to that active street front that we're looking for. On the right, you can see our examples of the transportation system diagrams. We have a cross-section there. And on the left, you can see what represents Restaurant Row, and then on the far side of the street, some taller mixed-use buildings there. Again, the idea is to create a visual representation of what we'd otherwise do with numbers and standards and text in the code. And on the bottom, you can see is an example of, in plan view, of the kind of street improvements we'd expect to see. Curb extensions at key locations, wider sidewalks, opportunities for green infrastructure, stormwater treatment, street trees, and the like. I think another key element here coming out of the master plan is some provisions for adaptive reuse. And so the idea is to try to facilitate some cost-effective tenant infill for the existing buildings on the property. In part, the hope is to retain some of the historic character, but also to make it a cost-effective opportunity for new tenants to move in. Here you can see an example of the steam plant building on the left, and what this represents is, again, a maximum building envelope that's shown, and the allowance for these existing buildings is for 30%, up to 30% expansion, without invoking all the various code standards for parking or for the new form-based standards other than what you see here. So in this example of the steam plant, the proposal is to allow it to be built up potentially 2 additional stories with a step back provided there. And the expansion in the case of the steam plant would only be allowed in the direction away from the river. And on the right here, you can see a diagram that is from the code showing the street system, but I think more importantly what it shows with those circled areas is what we call interim parking areas. And so the idea is, in terms of adaptive reuse, is to facilitate this sort of cost-effective opportunity for folks to move in and utilize those existing buildings, but they can rely on the existing surface parking in these particular areas. So the code will allow them to use that parking at the time as we see the site build out, and as it's redeveloped, we expect to see more in terms of structured parking or new parking provided within the mixed-use buildings. But so again, this is an opportunity to allow near-term benefits, but also keeps options open for the future in terms of redevelopment potential. I think another really important aspect of the code regulations that we've seen in the proposal is setbacks. And on the left here is an example of the code diagram for Restaurant Row. What it's attempting to show is that we will have setbacks that along the river side of Restaurant Row, we will have a requirement that those buildings be brought up to the riverfront street, but that toward the river, these setbacks will create space for open seating areas, and also pass-through areas for pedestrians that lead toward the river. On the right, you can see another example of the regulating plan, and it shows a newly established greenway setback that's proposed. And so it's variable. In some cases, I think at the south end, it's at about 125 feet, and at its closest, I think toward the north end and following along the existing buildings, it's as narrow as 25 feet. But so the variation there is in part related to the park proposal, but really it's also an important piece of meeting all the statewide planning goal requirements for the greenway and for the water resource protection. And so what this does is to create a level of protection along the river that will on the one hand, ensure that the park uses that are envisioned are really the only thing that is allowed to occur there, as opposed to mixed-use redevelopment. And it also ensures some opportunity for, one, protecting the existing vegetation, but also some enhancements along the river's edge. So this leads us to the proposal for the Parks and Open Space. And this slide attempts to show some of the detail that's embedded within the code. So based on what we heard from the public in the master planning process, one of the most important elements was the riverfront park. EWEB's proposing overall about 8 acres of parks and open space on the site, and that's about a third of the overall property involved. And you know, the code also includes a number of public amenities and improvements that will be required for park development, but those required improvements will be required to undertake a design review process. So there will be more opportunity for public input at that time, and in that review, the city will evaluate whether or not the proposal meets the design guidelines which are required coming out of the master plan. So we've set out a process to ensure that those guidelines are met at a future time when the park's developed. I'd also point out the park proposals really, it's been extensively reviewed by the city's Parks and Open Space staff. Key message we heard from them was the need for flexibility in future design and construction, given that we have some I think fairly detailed ideas coming out of the master plan about what we want in terms of those improvements and how we want it laid out. But in terms of some of the cost implications and feasibility, the Parks Department wanted to make sure that we had a future opportunity to look at that closer when we get to the time of potentially improving that park. I think that it's important also to note that while we may not have the funding sources identified at this point for the proposed park, that what this does in terms of the proposed code is to ensure from a regulatory standpoint that we will have a publicly accessible riverfront park coming out of this project. So I think another key element which I mentioned is design review, and in the case of the riverfront park, any future park development will require that design review approval. On the other hand, the process is intended to create some flexibility under certain standards for alternative proposals, designs that may not meet the particular code standards that are in place. But the idea is that it allows for, I like to think of it as an equal to or better than approach. And what it does is use a combination of the downtown adjustment review criteria as well as the policies from the Riverfront Master Plan as the approval criteria for that. So the idea is that we allow for some alternatives and for some flexibility, but that it still meets the intent of the vision from the plan, that it isn't so drastic that it's somehow inconsistent with that vision. And so one of the questions I'd encourage the council to consider as we move forward is really whether or not this proposed code and the design review process strikes the right balance between certainty and flexibility. That's really the intent of creating a special area zone and tailoring those standards to this particular site. So, in terms of next steps, we have a follow-up work session on June 12th. And of course, we'll take questions today and have an opportunity for follow-up in the case that we need to bring back more information. We'll have a council public hearing scheduled for June 17th. And then at this point, we have, I believe, 2 deliberation meetings scheduled, at least tentatively, for, I believe, July 10th and 22nd. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Randy Ledick to talk a little bit about the Planning Commission's review.
Thanks, Gabe. Mayor Piercy and members of the City Council, the Planning Commission conducted its public hearing on February 5th, and the overwhelming majority of testimony that we heard was in favor of this plan. There were 17 folks that testified in favor, 3 or 4 that were opposed to it for various reasons. Planning Commission subsequently devoted 3 full meetings to looking at the implementation ordinance, specifically the Downtown Riverfront Special Area Zone. We combed through the requirements, the code requirements, line by line, and ended up making 18 suggested changes. Half of those were simply clarifying recommendations pertaining to text and graphics. The other 9 were substantive. Included among those were increasing the height of buildings in certain parts of the plan, but doing that in such a way that the river and adjacent residential areas were protected, that is, making the height move away from those areas. We included recommendations for allowing balconies and other open space provisions in the development proposal. In regard to the steam plant to which Gabe referred, in case that doesn't meet an adaptive reuse, if it's removed, we wanted to make sure that the height of whatever might replace it was limited, impose the 55-foot limitation, which is about the height of the existing steam plant. We had a good deal of discussion about the sidewalk widths. This is getting right down into the weeds now. Residential setback requirements. We suggested that the minimum off-street parking ratio as well as the residential bicycle parking requirements be increased. We reviewed some landscaping issues and open space exemption provisions. And we also even adjusted the visible light transmittance standard for windows. And I'm not really prepared to get into that discussion, but I can point in the right direction. I want to say that throughout the process, the consultants, Raul Brokaw Architects, Cameron McCarthy Landscape Architects, the UWeb staff, and the city staff were extremely responsive, providing us information and adopting our recommendations. I believe that rolled into the ordinance that you're seeing are all 18 of our suggestions for your consideration. And I'll just conclude by saying that the Planning Commission was unanimous in its vote to recommend that you all adopt and approve this EWEB plan as well.
So you ready for some conversation? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to, I have Mike and Betty in the queue, and George, and Claire. And I'm going to start out by, what was the year the downtown plan was adopted? 2004. 4, right, okay. All right, and so tell me, I'm concerned, I guess, about how this plan connects to downtown. I'm concerned about how they will complement each other and not take away from each other. I'm concerned that all the work that we've done is enhanced by whatever we do along the riverfront, and I'm just telling you this, and you can answer that after I get through this. And I'm concerned that if we think about people living there, that maybe this is a time to think about garden space in that area as well. And the other question I had is, what's the thinking been about transit connections? I see bike. And then I assume that we're going to see some riprap perhaps removed along the.
Restoration work.
Is that a technical term, Mayor?
Yeah. So those are a bunch of my sort of what I'd like to. Whatever you can tell me in response to any of that, would appreciate.
The eWeb property is within our downtown plan boundary. So often when we talk about the core of downtown, we really focus on the Broadway-Willamette intersection. But in fact, this is so walkable from that intersection, and it really is a part of our downtown. So what we're trying to do is grow downtown to serve the community and really to economically serve the whole region. So in a way, what we're doing is following along the direction to grow downtown towards the river. The Northwest Community Credit Union is an example of the way we're moving, and there's other developments that are happening along 8th as well, a new brewery, in fact. So your question is, does it complement or compete? I think what we're trying to get to from a plan point of view is the moment that allows multiple opportunities to be considered and to be welcomed in downtown. Economics, as we know, are still challenging, so I'm not seeing as much the threat of competition just yet. There's room for development and there are opportunities for development, but we are seeing different kinds of development that might want to specifically be located on the eWeb site with the proximity to the riverfront that might not, for example, want to be located towards the west of downtown. So we're looking at this as opening up the opportunities to create the kind of downtown that we've envisioned.
I would also add that in terms of the concern about, or question about riprap along the river's edge, that issue was looked at pretty closely in the master plan process, as I understand it, through the ecological analysis that they performed and looking at the potential for restoration of the site, looking at the cost implications and also the implications for potential flooding and permitting requirements for doing that kind of in-water work, is that they ultimately decided to require a regrading of the edge along the river, but not to include removing that riprap. That will remain in place, but they've looked at opportunities for enhancing the plantings within the riprap and along that edge. Really, they're trying to create a better transition there and a gentler slope toward the river, but without causing particular or potential harm in doing so.
Was there talk about how transit would connect to that area?
Certainly making a transit connection has been part of the discussion from the start, and I can't speak for LTD, but we looked to see where LTD stops might connect much more closely to the eWeb site, so that really there are multiple ways to get to the eWeb site. If you can drive there, walk there, bike there, or transit.
Okay. I know in the discussion we were having about City Hall, and one of the issues was that there wasn't a good place for transit to get in, any kind of transit to get in near there. So just don't want us to overlook that. All right, so now, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate all of the work of both the Planning Commission staff and all of the volunteers and all the community members who participated in this process along the way. There are a lot of comments, but I'm going to keep mine focused and narrow, I think. One of the things that strikes me is that you mentioned, and based on these pictures, what I would consider a much larger chunk of public park than I would have thought would be put forward in this plan. With a fairly decent-sized public park right across the river, I would have hoped we would have been able to do a little bit more there, but that would constitute a comment about this, so I need to be careful. With the 8 acres that you have included as public park, I'm assuming that's then going to be city park, and city will need to take ownership of that land. Would I be right about that at some point?
What I would say is that no final decisions have been made in terms of the ultimate disposition or ownership of the park property. But again, from a regulatory standpoint, the code ensures that it will be publicly accessible, that it includes the kind of amenities that were envisioned in the master plan. So those decisions haven't been made yet.
What I'm getting to is, with our decision to accept or reject the master plan, it seems to me as though the city would then be obligating itself to purchase those 8 acres from eWeb at a price unset yet. Can you tell me how you address that concern? Mr. Manager?
I don't think that necessarily obligates us, because I know there is a portion of what would be designated as green space that eWeb actually might want to retain ownership of. And I don't know that for sure, but there's at least been some conversations around that. And so those are the kinds of things that would get worked out in some detail with eWeb. But so I wouldn't say it automatically assumes that the land is under city ownership and maintenance. That just hasn't been worked out.
Can you bring back up slide 20, please? So I see I was wondering if you might help me understand what the differentiation is on this particular picture, which parts are greenway and which parts would be considered park that would have to be under someone's ownership, I would think.
Yeah. So the colored areas represent the parks and open space that'll be designated through the new code. So those darker colors, the green variations in green, really represent the parks and open space zoning and the area, the footprint of what would be the new riverfront park, with a few extensions you can see of green space where they are showing what I would call green infrastructure for stormwater. But really, that is a representation of the footprint of the publicly accessible area.
Are you asking specifically where eWeb may or may not want to retain ownership on that? Is that part of your question, or?
Well, I would wonder how the process works once I'm looking for what are the consequences, intended or otherwise, of our approval of the master plan. And if one of those consequences, for example, is an assumption that we're going to purchase a particular percentage or a number of acres of parkland from eWeb, I'd say that's something under the current financial constraints we're in that we should think about, and what accepting this particular master plan means in its obligation to the city financially. So I'm just looking for more details there. Can you tell me more about what the group's thought process was in creating those parks and open space areas? Was there any part of the discussion involved there about how they would be managed, or who?
Yeah, and that would be, Planning Commission probably wouldn't have that conversation. What we have talked about.
The CAT, I meant, and the public input.
Oh, I don't know if you had public input on that or not.
No, we did not take input on that. Gabe, you want to fill us in a little bit? You talked about that at our meeting.
I'll address briefly the part that I know. In the conversations, we ran through, and the CAT ran through, a number of different scenarios, some of which was all public ownership, some of which was eWeb ownership with the city easement. So I can't speak to which is the most appropriate ownership or easement version, but what we're doing with the master plan is laying out where the park would be, but it does not specify who would own it.
And part of that, and we can get you some more detailed information, but a little bit of how the.
Forgive me for interrupting, sir. I apologize. The reason I ask that is because that seems like with a master plan, you want to make sure we're dealing with this appropriately with the law. But I also would hate to see it be an unclear expectation in the public about whether eWeb's going to retain that and manage it, and thus the cost, or whether that'll be borne by the city.
What's a little bit of a chicken and egg conversation is a portion of how the process works is eventually eWeb will, if for any properties that they choose not to retain ownership or they would like to dispose of, they have to essentially get our permission to do that. And so part of that, they apply, and then I make a determination, are we willing to surplus that property immediately, or are there further considerations of that? Part of that whole conversation gets involved in who retains ownership of the green space and the ongoing maintenance of the green space. And so the chicken and the egg part, I think, is it's hard to know what that space is unless there's a master plan that designates it. And until you know that, it's hard to know specifically who's going to own which piece. And so we can get a little bit more information on that, but part of that's the ongoing conversation of who should own it, who would like to own it, what's the advantages and disadvantages of owning a portion of it, and what is the legal form of which that actually gets owned. Is it ownership, is it easement, and then who maintains those things? All of that still will have to get worked out as we go through the process. I would not anticipate us knowing the details of that prior to you potentially taking action on the total master plan.
Okay. And lastly, what flexibility has council in amending this prior to accepting it?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Could we say we want less master, or rather less open or park space in this particular plan?
Absolutely. It's certainly within the council's purview to change any of the provisions that are proposed in the land use applications.
Okay.
So the code could be amended and
more.
Whichever way. There is that flexibility through this process.
But the council retains the authority to change the master plan with regard to the details involved in this.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Betty?
Thank you. This always seems very strange to me when we talk about things that we can't express an opinion on. And it seems that we can't express an opinion until it's been decided, and then it's too late. That's just a comment, I guess. But after Mike's question, it sounds as if we could at some point make changes, although I might want to make, theoretically, the opposite kinds of changes. How soon do you anticipate that something will actually be built there?
That's a good question. It's something that we talked about a lot through the process, and I know there was a lot of interest on the part of Planning Commission about that as well. And I know, for example, that EWEB and their consultant team have looked to a number of local developers and outside the community, both to evaluate the code and see that it's feasible in terms of the actual standards and what they might intend to build, really exploring that feasibility, looking at some market analysis to see what the potential for redevelopment is. But I don't think that we have any particular or specific developer that has come forward with a plan or a timeline. And so really what I see in this plan is a proposal with the code to keep as many options open as possible. It could occur in any number of scenarios, the way in which the property is developed and how it's phased, and so that's also uncertain at this point.
You think a year, 2 years, 3 years?
It's hard to say.
Not even that close. Not even as close as our 2-year city hall, or 2.5 year. And when you say it wouldn't compete with downtown, there's the west part of downtown. Broadway Place, for example, has had a very great difficulty using their commercial space. So when you think of new commercial space, I wonder why you think that wouldn't compete.
The commercial space that would be available on the eWeb property would really be a different type of space. First of all, we are watching the market change over the last year or so. We're seeing all kinds of developments happening in downtown that much more than we even thought was possible, and they're happening sooner. But this is really a part of downtown, and I think that we're trying to just open up different opportunities for different kinds of commercial uses and residential uses on that site that we don't have already downtown.
And I guess I would add on to that. Remember, part of the Envision Eugene process is what we've what we've said there is we want to focus development into the current urban growth boundary, and actually as compact in urban development as we can. And this site actually was an important part of that. And so we said in order to accommodate the growth that we're required to accommodate, some of that growth will actually occur here, both on the residential side and the commercial side as well. And so I don't know if it competes as much as it allows compact urban development to occur that we're anticipating having to accommodate, as opposed to expanding the urban growth boundary more to accommodate that.
To try to say something as a question instead of a statement, I wonder
You always
if
just add, isn't that so, at the end? Do you think?
do you think perhaps it might be better to have intense development where there is development before you start developing other places? And I'll just leave that as an open question. One thing you said was build to the line, and I know that has caused some problems out on West 11th. We had this code that said you build up to the line, up to the street, then later want to widen the street, in that case for buses. And it's causes some real problems of circling around. And and the mayor already asked about public transit, but if you build to the line, does that leave room for transit?
Yeah, and what I would say is that it's my understanding through the master plan that those issues were closely looked at in crafting a particular set of standards for the width of the proposed streets, knowing the kind of improvements that we wanted within those streets in terms of wider sidewalks and curb extensions, and really accommodating, on-street parking. And really, I think the difference in a scenario like this is that we get to start whole cloth with looking at the framework of the property without existing development, as you might have on West 11th or South Willamette, where we're trying to respond to, existing buildings that are located either closer or farther from the street. Here, we've taken a holistic look at that, and I think it's an important part of the urban design principles that we're embedding in this proposed code to bring those buildings up to the street. And we've also built in some flexibility so that the entire building, for example, is not required to be built up to that line, but there are allowances for some percentage to be recessed to create enhanced pedestrian space, open seating areas along the street's edge. So there is some flexibility there. There is also, in some cases, the ability through design review to look at alternatives.
Does all of this assume that eWeb's going to relocate their offices?
I think it's possible that eWeb may face that decision, and they'll have to decide what works best for them. The master plan allows the administration building to stay certainly in office use or for eWeb's existing use. So the master plan really lays out what could happen on the site and what form should future development take. It's not as specific as to what is within each individual building or on each individual floor. So they can stay there, but that would end up being an eWeb decision that they'll have to face in the future.
And did I understand that in some places the setback from the river is only 25 feet? I heard you say 100 feet someplace. You said 25 feet someplace.
That's right. The new greenway setback is established to follow the boundary, the front edge of some of the existing buildings. So, for example, along the front edge of the steam plant and the headquarters building, it certainly comes closer than 100 feet. But in other areas, it's wider. And so it's variable, but the idea is that we want to try to facilitate reuse of those existing buildings, and so that's why the proposal sets the line along that front edge of the building.
So that's the only place there would be the smaller setback where there are existing buildings?
That's right.
Because I think that's really not up to Willamette Greenway standards, but I know it's already there. And the bike path will be moved away from the river, I assume?
It will, and again, I think that some of the existing buildings on the site create some constraints there, but it will be moved back. It will remain a continuous bike path, but toward I'd say the middle of the site, it's certainly a fair distance farther than it is now along that steep edge right up to the top
Who
of Bank.
pays for that movement?
Well, again, I don't think that those decisions have been made in terms of who would pay for those improvements.
Thank you. I see my time is up.
Brown?
Thank you, Mayor. My first question is for Randy. You mentioned that the Planning Commission developed the 18 points.
Yes.
And you haven't sent those to council, have you?
I have a list here with me. We've
Can
also
we see those?
Yeah, you may.
I don't recall seeing that in any of the material.
So I would also add that in the agenda item summary for today's meeting, I included a link which would take you to the complete record of materials, and at the top of that set of documents is the Planning Commission recommendations.
good.
I can give you a copy today to look at as well.
Well, that'd be okay too. But thanks. I somehow missed that. My second question is, since this area is already in the downtown plan, I'm wondering why we have to create a special zone for it. I mean, why couldn't we just change it from industrial to whatever parcels we might want to make, like residential, commercial, so on?
Yeah.
Why do we have to create a special zone?
That's a good question. And as I understand it, the master planning process looked at the possibility of relying on existing zoning districts, for example, looking at the C2 commercial zone, and felt that through some of that public input that there were provisions in there that just would not work for this site in terms of the building height at 120 feet, in terms of some of the allowances for particular uses that really wouldn't fit here. And so it was through that process and through some, I think, close involvement of city staff and looking at what the options were to create these tools to implement the master plan. And we felt that, I think collectively, that the special area zone would be perhaps the best approach to customize the standards to this particular site, that it has a unique set of existing conditions, relationships to the river and to downtown, and that this is a way to tailor the code to the particular vision coming out of the plan, that it would be difficult to assure that vision is certain and that it would be implemented through our typical zoning districts. So.
Okay. Well, kind of following on, I think I know what the answer will be, but kind of following on Councilor Clark's question about, does this presume that the city would, buy this land for EWEB for the parks? I see that the street runs through here. The street would be constructed to run between certain buildings and Restaurant Row, and it looks like it's 8th Street, and then goes north and then loops around and connects with 5th. Seems like we're accepting the idea that the city would build this street, and who would pay for the street,
And I would respond by saying that's not necessarily the case, that through the future redevelopment process, in my experience with land divisions and development review, there's at least a percentage of those costs that are borne by the developer, that they have an obligation to make a proportional contribution to those improvements. And so we'll be looking at those opportunities in the future to leverage dollars appropriately for the public improvements. Now, that doesn't answer the question about what potential monies might come from the city or from EWEB or other sources, but we're also looking at other public-private partnerships and any number of other ways that funding might come forward.
Okay, thanks. And then I guess you mentioned earlier that there's lots of uncertainties, and there certainly are. I'm just wondering, is EWEB going to sell all this property? Are they going to try to sell it as one big block? Or are they going to parcel it out, to individual developers? Are they going to retain part of it and do like a ground lease, like the county is proposing to do with the potential OB project over there? Has there been any discussion of that? I mean,
There has, and I know they've actively pursued potential developer interest. They've looked at a number of scenarios. Even within the master plan, they looked at some scenarios of how the parcels might be divided in the future. They've looked at potential build-out scenarios to really get a sense of what they can expect and how they might market the property. But again, those decisions really haven't been made without a particular developer at the table.
Right.
And so, again, I think the approach is to try to craft as flexible of a redevelopment scenario as possible to hopefully
Maximize
allow any number of
response.
options that might come forward.
yeah, okay. Let's see, what else? Yeah. Oh, yeah, one more point in this round. I've heard before that there's a brownfield. Is that kind of like near the substation on the far eastern part? And that would be where the park would be, because without really cleaning it up, you couldn't really put a
Right.
commercial building or residence there.
So, as I understand it, there are some contaminated areas on the site. I believe it was a manufactured gasification plant way back when, but at the south end of the property there, I think that John mentioned also that eWeb may be retaining some ownership, and I think they will be retaining ownership of that southern portion. Within the park, that's also identified as an area that I believe they call it a pollinator prairie, or that they intend to actually build up a little bit for views of the river, and that really won't be redeveloped for mixed use.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Claire, you're next.
Thank you. So forgive this kind of basic question because I'm pretty new to the whole planning scene. So when we say something is mixed-use designation, what does that include?
That includes a combination of commercial, industrial, and residential uses. So really, it's a generous mixing of all the types of uses we'd see in our typical zones that are segregated, say between an industrial zone, commercial, or residential. So it mixes all of those. But in this case, what the proposal does is have special limitations depending on what sub-area within the site that we're at to allow certain uses and not others. And so, again, I think it favors residential use above the first floor. It favors, for example, restaurant uses and retail along Restaurant Row. But that designation is really, I think, set up well for a special area zone like this, where we're crafting a custom set of allowed uses.
And was there any manufacturing or industrial use included in this vision?
There are some allowances for what I would consider light or clean industrial uses. It carries forward some of the limitations we have in our neighborhood commercial zones for what I would say are maybe employment-type uses, or maybe have some industrial component, but not heavy industrial uses, not polluting type uses, but ones that hopefully will fit with the fabric here of trying to encourage, employment, people, live-work situations, and the like.
Do you have examples of something like that? What would be an example of that?
I've got them here, Gabe. For example, breweries, catering establishments, electric motor repair, printing, publishing, research and development.
And what about artisan use? That's maybe not listed, but that...
Like weaving or production of textiles or apparel.
Or, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's very interesting. Some of what I was going to ask about was addressed with the who's paying question, and also the question about the amount of green open space, access to the riverfront, which we may get to discuss more in the future, apparently. I was surprised to hear you say that the bike path is going to be redirected away from where it currently is, and so I was wondering how much input was received from folks who bike along the bike path as it's constructed now.
Mm-hmm. As I understand it, there was a lot of input from interested community members, folks that were particularly concerned about the relationship between bike users and pedestrians. And so one interesting piece of the park proposal is that it includes a boardwalk that's actually grade separated. It's a little bit higher than the relocated bike path. So the idea is to allow some of that through traffic, that through bicycle traffic moving a lot faster, and to create a safe zone, so to speak, and a more friendly area for pedestrians on the boardwalk.
That's great. And when we talked about housing, potential residential housing, was the type of housing identified, whether affordable, high-end, any particulars with that?
No, there's no particular provision relating to affordable housing or a certain percentage of units that might be lower income. But what it does do is facilitate a variety of housing types. The idea is that everything from an apartment type use to potentially private ownership with condos, even maybe 3-story walk-up townhomes. So really the idea is to create some variety, opportunity for different housing types, but to preclude what we would consider sort of the suburban style single family development.
Right. And then there are 2 water features drawn out besides the current existing fountain. Can you tell me a little bit about the nature of those 2 water features?
Yeah, as I understand it, these are part of their proposal for what they call green infrastructure. And so these are areas that would be available for open swales, stormwater treatment, sort of capturing the pollutants from the site, from the proposed streets and the hardscapes, and treating those that water before it goes to the river.
So are those things that currently exist now? They're just not open, accessible, seen by the public?
No.
Okay, so they're not even there yet. And then you mentioned the public access would be, it sounded like you said, I don't think this is what you meant, but you said that the green space along the riverfront would be the primary public access, but the roads and bike paths, excuse me, and sidewalks within the development would all be public right away as well.
Yes, for some of the secondary streets, the option is available to do private streets or access ways, as we call them under the code. But there certainly is a requirement for public street connectivity. The main sort of backbone of this is the connection to 5th and 8th along the new riverfront street, and so that is assured to be public.
That is?
Yes.
Okay. And then just, this may not be relevant with how this development actually ends up happening, but you talked about existing parking lots being there and then at some point maybe being built up, and that just seems like that could really cause some upheaval if there's a lot of development and then a decision to create structured parking or underground or any of that.
Well, I think that the proposal takes an approach to parking that tries to allow for, facilitate the early redevelopment by using those surface parking areas. I think the expectation is that eventually those will be redeveloped with more intensive uses, and that as they're redeveloped, for example, with a mixed-use building on a particular site, that as parking becomes more constrained and as the land becomes more valuable for that mixed-use redevelopment, that the structured parking would be paid for and provided within those new private buildings. Yeah.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you. Very interesting. I was really looking forward to getting the information after so long. I just have a couple of points. They've already been mentioned, but I just will drill in a little bit deeper on them. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be in Chicago for a week, and as you know, Chicago's a community that's been very highly planned almost since its very beginning. And I went on an Architecture Foundation tour, and that emphasized to me a couple of elements, which is what I want to talk about. And the first one is with regard to access. We've talked a little bit about access. I want to drill more deeply into it in terms of not only destination access, but also casual access. We've talked about does it compete or will it complement downtown? And I think to some degree its accessibility will be the determining factor on that. And so I think I would like much more detail on how this development plan accommodates destination access, but also casual access, because I think that'll be an extremely important element in terms of its overall viability. So I'm very interested in that. particularly around its relationship to downtown. The second element then is specific to, we've also talked about this, the partnerships and how those partnerships will work. In order to be a successful multi-use, and that includes both public and private as well as other uses, I would like more information on exactly what we're envisioning for the kinds of partnerships that would occur, specifically around funding. I know you haven't got any funding nailed down yet, but what are the potential funding partnerships that could be formed? The specific areas would be around infrastructure, public space, and incentives. What could the public money be for doing that? What could the private money be? And what could the combinations of money be to accomplish those in different scenarios? Because the way this looks, you've got combinations of different kinds of uses. Each one has its own unique funding combination. I'd be curious to know, at least tentatively, what those might look like and what the sources would be, because there's a variety of different sources that could be taken advantage of. I'd be really interested in knowing what your thinking is on what those sources might be to pay for those different things, particularly infrastructure, I think is a real important one. And what the ratios would be. Different kinds of areas may have ratios for funding that are different from other areas. Some may be 100% publicly funded, others may be 100% privately funded, and then others are some mix in between. I'd be real interested in knowing what those combinations potentially could be. So those are my two. The access, how would that work? And then also, what are the partnership opportunities so that the ability for this to be viable and successful it runs on money, and really knowing what the money, how the money works out, at least tentatively, would be very helpful. Thank you.
Greg.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm going to go and start beating my transit drum on this because I find it a little, I'm concerned about the fact that LTD has not really been brought into this conversation, discussion. You know, we've done this for years as we plan developments, whether it's residential, commercial, mixed use, or whatever. And then the last thing we do is look at transit. And if I take a 10,000-foot view of this and look at the entire area, it cries out for connectivity with, you know, either what would in my mind be the optimum would be a streetcar connection between Oakway, downtown, Riverfront, and the University of Oregon, or in lieu of the fact that that may not be economically feasible at this point in time, that we at least be planful for maybe the breeze coming back as an option. So if you're going through this area, say at Christmas time, and you want to shop Oakway, go downtown, shop there, come over to the riverfront and end your day eating dinner, you don't really have a real viable way to do that. You know, and it's not really kind of that walkability connectivity to the rest of the downtown footprint. And I think that we really need to kind of go back and look at that. The second thing is I'm also looking at the issue of parking and going back to what Councilor Surratt talked about. Has there been any conversation about smart parking? I've seen this in Dallas, where they have conserved the footprint of their parking development through an automated parking system that basically takes your car into an area and puts it in kind of a Chester drawer kind of deal, where you get out of the car, you walk out, and then, you know, the automation takes care of everything, including stacking your car where you need to have it stacked, which is a real efficient way of maximizing a very small footprint in terms of these kinds of things. And I think that we need to look at, you know, utilizing or creating the atmosphere where that technology can be used.
Thank you. Alan.
It's just a matter of cost. I suspect that's really, really expensive. Randy, you mentioned that in your public hearing at the Planning Commission, you had 5 people that were in opposition, you said, for various...
3 or 4.
3 or 4. Can you kind of summarize what their nature of their opposition is?
If you'll give me just a second, Counselor. Yeah, I think the most substantive one had to do with much of what was being discussed here, and that was the degree to which the economic analysis, the financial feasibility has been developed for this project is not only in terms of the testimony in opposition to this, but also the Planning Commission had some concerns with how much is this all going to cost, who's going to pay for it. And there is at least an initial economic analysis that's part of the package, probably on the website, but that was the crux of it. Who's going to pay for it? And we really haven't delved into that to the depth that I think many of you all would probably appreciate as well.
Yeah, I had a question about the list and the cost of the public improvements, as well as the tools and the funding sources for those public improvements, like the Riverfront Urban Renewal District, the balance that's there, plus the tax increment financing, how would that play, and if it's significant, SDCs existing and new, general fund, if any, that's always a possibility, but less and less likely, road fund, which is bankrupt, but so if we could get that information, that would be great. Also, the percentage of development in terms of square feet that is retail, office, and housing. Get that mix. That'd be good. A lot of discussion about the acres of park, but as I understand it, the Willamette Greenway requires that land be set aside and there be a riparian zone. What percentage of that area that we've been talking about is just legally required to be open space anyway?
That's a good question. So under Goal 15, the Willamette Greenway goal, there is not a specific numeric setback established, and it really directs each jurisdiction to establish its own. In this case, we only have one area within the city, the Willackenzie Plan area along the north side of the river, that has an adopted setback, which is actually set at 35 feet. For other areas, as we review development through land use applications under a greenway permit, the criteria require that we establish adequate setback lines that protect the scenic and natural values along the river. And so it's really a case-by-case basis.
So this plan does that?
It does, and so we've evaluated the Goal 15 requirements closely and made sure that the application materials have all the findings and the evidence that's needed to really respond to that issue. And so, at least from staff's perspective in looking at that, it meets the requirements of the goal.
So the setback in the Willamette Greenway, is that just part of the landowner's application, or is that something the city ends up having to buy?
It does not define ownership. It really only separates buildings from the river. So what it really does is create a setback for new buildings that are not, quote, water related or water dependent. So some things, for example, maybe it's bathrooms or some sort of a picnic shelter might be allowed within the park, but not the kind of mixed-use redevelopment buildings we'd expect to see. So it's really focused on the separation of buildings from the river.
Yeah, so if you could clarify for us the Willamette Greenway and the other parts of open space, that would be great.
Yeah.
A lot of this has to do with other questions I had relate to form-based code, and I've been a skeptic of form-based code. I think it's a planning fad, the planning fad du jour, and we'll see if it's around in 10 to 20 years. It has potential, but it also has a lot of potential for uncertainty as well, and in my opinion, it creates less uncertainty with a lot of potential problems around it. We don't have any implementation of form-based code as far as I know in Eugene. We have the Walnut Station, which was our first experiment into form-based code, but nothing's actually been developed. So we'll have to see how that actually ends up going. I'll need around two.
Okay. George.
Well, I really don't have any questions at this point because most of them have already been answered. But I would like to just recognize all the hard work that's been put into this project up to this point, not only by the Planning Commission and by staff, but by the people that showed up to all the meetings and open houses. And, you know, in typical Eugene fashion, I think we've really processed this pretty well. And, you know, and we needed to, because this is a very sensitive area, and what we do with it, we're going to be stuck with it for a very long time. So I'm glad that we're going through the process that we are, and we're taking the time that we are, because it's a very vital change for the complexion of our downtown. And I think some of the questions that have been asked, we're not going to know the answers until the very last day when they start turning dirt, if they ever start turning dirt. So I'm looking forward to the public hearing and our additional work sessions, and up to the point we make our decision.
So a couple comments is that I think maybe it was the second year I was mayor, I was invited to to San Francisco, where the architects work with mayors on particular projects, and this was the area that we worked on, and with some of the architects that participated in that. And one of the things they said is that they thought it was a perfect area to be developed in much the way you're talking about, but that it would be really, it should have something that's special and different, more river-oriented. River-oriented housing, river-oriented options for people to do, river-oriented stores, things that really created a whole nother niche for activity and the way people live in our community. And it seems to me, as we think about young people that we want to have their businesses here and stay here and be part of our community, this is an opportunity for us to, with the help of private partners, to see something happen in that area that would be a really great incentive for people to stay in our community. And we should all be thinking about how we use this to build a bigger whole for all of us. One of the people are drawn here because they love our outdoors and they love our livability, so we want to keep that, but also creating more activities that allow people to participate here in our community. This is a place that we can do that. So just asking for people to think about that. And then I really appreciate what Greg brought up. I think we should be looking at this and asking ourselves how we look at this through our triple bottom line lens. And we should really think about it like that. And I would say that the things that many of you brought up, but certainly what Greg brought up about really getting into what transit could and should do, and to take it really seriously now. And I would also say that maybe the Breeze could, you've heard me say this before, maybe the Breeze could be our little further bus that is the circulating bus. It's characteristic of our community that people couldn't wait to get on to travel from one part of the community to the other. I guess what I'm saying is, if we're going to do something, let's do it in character with ourselves, and let's make it work for us in ways of the things that we genuinely care about. And I think a lot of that work has been done, but maybe we can add some layers to that as well. And I would remind people that our neighboring city, Springfield, has had a laser-like focus on Glenwood for a very long time, where they looked out in the future and said, someday we hope it to be this, and then they've assembled all the things to try to move it in that direction. It doesn't happen in 1 year or 2 years. It is something that you have to have a vision about and keep moving in the same direction, and this is our opportunity. George Brown.
Thanks, Mayor. Well, I'm kind of on the same page with Councilor Zelenka about not being infatuated with form-based code. I fail to see the logic of it. This is just a comment. I don't have any questions about it. I think it's actually kind of boring. But, I just wanted to make another comment of, this is such an intriguing area, and it's just loaded with all kinds of really neat potentials. But I just think that the council, we need to keep in mind, especially when any public expenditures are going to be proposed to be used here, we just have to proceed really carefully. And I'm thinking of Salem's riverfront development that's stalled, and it's failing now, it's stalled. And I'd hate to see us get into a situation where we invest a lot of money and then prematurely and then get into trouble that way. So it's just something for us to think about as we move along with this proposal. Thanks.
Alan?
Yeah, so this is a hybrid of form-based code and traditional. So can you bring back to us kind of what part of this is form-based code and what part of this is traditional, and give us examples and be specific about how the traditional part of the hybrid model, where it applies, how it gets applied, and what part the form-based code is. I don't know what Randy was reading when he had those lists of different uses.
It's the code.
Yeah. So I'd be happy to touch on that today and also offer to follow up with more detail to give you some of the specifics, because I think it does involve looking more closely at the code provisions themselves. But I think the most obvious distinctions between the sort of traditional zoning code and the form-based elements here, one, it's the graphics. That for the most part, our code does not rely on graphics to articulate what the standards mean and how they're to be used. That's really one of the biggest differences. The design review process is another key element that has some similarities to our existing code and to what we'd call adjustment review, but the idea here is to have a more robust set of policies and approval criteria that relate to the master plan, as opposed to a more generic one-size-fits-all type of approach. It's specific and tailored to this site. The other aspect that I think is important to point out is how it incorporates urban design requirements. So things like the 14-foot first floor requirement, window transparency requirements, entrance and building orientation, the kind of articulation we expect to see, even things like for Restaurant Row requiring that the rooftop space be either accessible for open seating or provided as an eco roof. So there are some things in the proposal that are very unique to the site and form-based, really focused on the form as opposed to a concern about particular individual uses that might be located within the building. And so I think the more traditional aspects are that we still have a use list. We haven't thrown that out entirely like some form-based codes might. We still have to integrate this code with all of the other standards in Chapter 9. And so a variety of stormwater standards or flood hazard standards or any number of other standards I can think of that are existing in the code and any other development would have to comply with. We've integrated this code to make sure and to make choices about what standards need to be tailored for this site as opposed to just relying what's already in the code.
Yeah, if you could get us the use list and things like that, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
As well as what's traditional and what's hybrid. We don't have design review as part of our regular development in Eugene, so I'm wondering, that comes in because we have a new plan here. And what's the extent of the design review here, and will it prevent dumb things from happening like that metal shed building that we had over in the development, the commercial industrial development area, in the middle of all that nice development over by Costco and Oregon Community Credit Union. There's this metal shed building which sits out like a sore thumb. Does it prevent things like that from happening?
I think what I would advise is that that the council look closely at the policies. I've actually included the set of policies as an attachment to your agenda item summary. That's really the heart of the design review process. It sets the criteria based on the policy direction coming out of the Riverfront Master Plan, and so those are specially crafted for this site to try to ensure that we don't end up with a scenario like you described, something that sticks out that doesn't fit the vision. It also blends with the criteria for downtown adjustment review. So it's a pretty robust set of approval standards, the way I see it, that really the goal is to try to avoid a scenario like you described. So.
Last question is going back to the riparian area. What's the requirements around that for it to be appropriate natural vegetation rather than lawn to the river with chemicals that flow straight into the river? And what kind of protections are there for that? What are the rules around that?
Well, there are a set of design guidelines that come out of the Riverfront Master Plan. I can provide that for our next meeting so you have a more clear picture of it. It really walks through a variety of details, everything from the overlooks and the location of interpretive sites and the kind of plant materials. There's actually a plant list that comes out of the applicant's ecological analysis. And so, for the most part, I think there are some exceptions, but for the most part, we're assured of native plantings that will integrate well with the river's edge there and provide some natural resource benefit in the expanded open space. Yeah, but I think it was important for our Parks Department to have some flexibility in the kind of, the specific type of grass or for some of the more active areas, making sure that we weren't precluding some of the kind of different types of active recreational uses we might also want to see along the river. So it's a combination of those factors that led to the
lawns
list.
to the river, that wouldn't be allowed.
No.
That's all I had right now, Mayor.
Greg?
Real quickly, what if any discussion was there around upfront development of public-private partnerships as a tool and a leverage to extend our ability to create that development?
All along, from the time that the Community Advisory Team began meeting, the question of who would pay for which improvement was part of the discussion. But instead of focusing on coming to an answer prematurely, what the group provided, the insight that they provided was on what they wanted to see at the riverfront. And then they did leave the question of who would pay for which part, either the infrastructure improvements or the park or some of the amenities. That is left for a later discussion. So the master plan does not contain that information.
Good. And two other things. Alan, I do know a guy. So as far as smart parking is concerned, I think it could be economically viable. And lastly, this creates some opportunity for us to create a theme, not just around the riverfront development, but the whole downtown corridor, whether you want to call it the Emerald Triangle or, whatever kind of district that you want to create. I think if we develop that connectivity, even creating, if we work with LTD, we can create a thematic bus, if you will, not just kind of the breeze, but, some a kind of a hybrid, kind of a tour transit kind of thing that really makes it attractive, allows people to be able to engage it, and then gives us further connectivity with MX and the downtown transit station. I think would really, really help this out quite a bit.
Good choice of words, a further connection.
Yeah.
I just wanted to remind us that over this last years, we've talked on and on and on a lot about the inflexibility of our code. And we've talked about how hard it is, how slow it is to change it. We've talked about one size doesn't fit all, and our neighborhood associations have reminded us of that incessantly. So I just want you to sort of bear that in mind as you think about this. There is a tension between tying things down and allowing yourself some flexibility, and it is a kind of a challenging thing to find the right place. But I do think we've heard loud and clear that it seems like it takes an earthquake to change the code. So I think you have an opportunity here to try to create a little bit more flexibility that allows you to learn and change things as time moves forward. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.